Susan and Robert Larkin, okay, were born in continental Europe, again de-identified, and sent their first kids, their older kids, in schools in continental Europe, cast their outsider eye on the process. We interviewed many, many people, by the way. Okay, this is a very short little description of what we did. As they experienced their own schooling in Europe and their two older children attended higher education here. I always gave people the option, the parents the option, of who they wanted to sit down with me. And most of the time, two parents wanted to sit down with me. They wanted to talk. If it was a man and a woman, oftentimes the woman said less, the man said more. But in fact, most of this, as I'm going to talk in a minute, most of this strategizing and prodding is women's work, has become women's work. This is a step up from the kind of stuff we know from the UK, where much of that work was done in early childhood education. This is now another thing that is landing on the plate, or however one wants to put it, of many of these women, and these women are often professionals or high-level managers. So this has been added to their own dossier, if you will. So here's Susan. So I would say the last 8 to 10 years, that means children were in early middle school, if not grade 5. I've heard parents talking about it, the college application admissions process. Here I'm not talking about everything that people do to position for entry to high school. Of course they do that. We talk about that some in the book. We're not talking about Kumin classes at age 2 on the Upper East Side in New York City. They may do that too, okay? But that's not this. This linchpin, I will argue, is at the point of college admissions. And we've got anecdotal evidence that people are calling from the Bay Area, parents are calling from the Bay Area to Harvard to find out which preschool they should send their children to in order to enter Harvard. Now, Harvard doesn't answer, okay? Harvard is not responding to that question. But that is exactly what's going on in this particular thing. By the way, media coverage of this is twofold. Media coverage is that these people are crazy, right? I mean, parents are crazy. They're nuts. They sound crazy. They're hyper. They're helicopter parents and so forth. And the other new media thing that's coming out is, oh, you terrible, highly educated women, you're now, with this assortative mating, you're now responsible for the intensification of inequalities in this country, because the men who used to marry people who weren't as highly educated are now marrying people or partnering with people who are as educated. So that's the media coverage. Now, critical bifocality leads us another direction. Okay? Critical bifocality is telling us to look elsewhere and not blame these individuals that are inside this particular set of pressures. Parents of older children, I would say maybe even into middle school, parents are conniving and contriving. Robert, from my point of view, in a real sense, the conniving and contriving started in sophomore year, which is second year in the United States, became much more apparent. So we had heard, Susan, probably more than I had, we'd heard the noise, some of the sure things, but it didn't have anything to do with us, things that we had to do as parents. And I think it was at that level we began to realize that it was competitive. And maybe you could have started to send your child to a particular place, a particular institution, to do extracurriculars. And you would tell your colleagues, in other words, other parents of children in the class afterwards, to show how good you were, but you wouldn't actually bring them all together and say, why don't we all send our children to the local cancer research facility to do cancer research? Because everyone, and this is what Robert's saying, everyone wanted to get a step ahead with their children, was my impression. So they began to feel this intensification. This has now become sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but I'll think of it in a second. But there has been work done on this, where this is now the model of good parenting in the United States. This is the model of good parenting. And if you don't do this, you are not a good parent. I understand that at the University of Chicago press board meeting, where this was published, that they actually had a big discussion about this, with half the members of the board, and I understand they're all faculty members, saying this is just good parenting. And the other half saying, this is insane. They like the book, okay? But this is now becoming identified as good parenting in the United States. There may be a slight shift. So Susan and Robert, as a result of this, began to encourage Stephanie to maximize her international roots, thereby distinguishing herself. This is all about distinguishing oneself, distinguishing oneself inside a new field of action, even though they don't use those terms, from others in the college competition. And obviously, Bourdieu's work is very helpful in thinking about this. Susan said, I did say to Stephanie, it's all well to say you've traveled. But further down the line, this may be mistaken for colleges, because colleges, these kinds of colleges, read all the dossiers. They don't only sort by SAT 1 scores and therefore lop off a whole bunch of kids. Thinking, here's a rich kid driving around in expensive cars, you know, staying at a Best Western overseas. I said to her, maybe you have to demonstrate you can do more than that. I knew she could. So I put it to her that she should volunteer at a home in Bogota. And it was started and run by a former colleague of mine. Now, obviously, the social capital is coming to play here. From the firm, because otherwise it might have been hard for us to get there because of her age. She was a minor. Now this has, talk about an architecture of capital accumulation, okay? Because if you look at the language here, her adaptability, she's overseas experience, she has to write, like all people in the United States who are trying to position for a four-year institution, they have to write a personal statement or an admissions essay. Sometimes they have to write 3. Look at all she had to write about, okay? I'm not saying this is not a worthy thing to do, but this group of people is highly conscious, and they have what I call global sensibilities, a sense of global sensibilities being a good thing. What Americans do not understand is that people, by and large, is that people in China, people in Korea now have special schools with special tracks set up to produce dossiers to enter American institutions. This is now a global competition for the same schools that Americans are attempting to position for. Okay? So this language of sort of competence, global competence is one, there's lots of things to keep your eye on, but that's one of them, okay?